I want to thank everyone for coming in and being with us. A lot of folks have been here with us all week, so I really appreciate that. This is our 11th week of covering the Ukrainian-Russian war, with the invasion by the Russians in Ukraine. And this is our fifth night this week. We've now have close to 50 presentations from photojournalists covering this invasion. That is really, really an intense collection. You can go to our YouTube page, Projections NYC, and see them all. So this week we've had Ken Sedano, Svet Jacqueline, Alan Chin, William Patrick Patterson, and tonight we have Wolfgang Schwan.
I think at 2 in the morning there, or midnight, she is a bit more coherent than I am at 7:30 at night here. Um, Give me 1 second. So let me share my screen. So I'm Wolfgang Schwan. I'm a photojournalist based in Philadelphia, but the past 2 years I've spent about half of that time in Ukraine covering the conflict there. And give me 1 second. This is up?
We have the grid now.
Cool. Give me 1 sec. And so I haven't been on since the beginning of 2023 with you guys. And that was I showed the latter half of 2022, the work that I had done there then. So this is basically my entire 2023, and I whittled it down to like 150 photos. So we'll try and move quick so that everyone can get to bed. And so the things that I kind of covered while there this past year, um, I had gone in with the intention both times of pretty promising, like long embed access with different groups in the military. And both times that I went, immediately before going, there was kind of a pause on military access, and like these sort of things, they ebb and flow in any conflict. And if the situation is like a little bit more delicate, or if it's not going as well for, in this example, Ukraine, I was arriving towards the end of the Battle of Bakhmut, when it was a little bit more in Russia's favor at that time. Access shriveled a lot in the winter when I arrived. This was like February of 23. And then again I arrived like during the counteroffensive, or on the tail end of the counteroffensive last end of summer. And in those kind of times, like the military will kind of just bar access for journalists because they don't want to show troop movements. They don't want to show um, dead soldiers, that kind of thing, for morale reasons, which is another end of like propaganda on like any country at war. They have to win the information space, and there's like do's and don'ts on things that they want to show to keep morale up or keep spirits high in the country. And it's an understandable one. Like the US military does that. Every military has their rules. So the things that I came up with to work on were in the northern area of Donbass, the area that had been liberated in the counteroffensive in 2022 in the summer and then the fall, what life was like in winter in these areas that they had been liberated. They're back in Ukrainian control, but the hardships that they're still facing, like heat and electricity, and how they're getting their food and all of that. I did do, Frank, I know you said enough with the Hasidics, but I went and covered the
Wait,
Uman
wait, 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 wait,
pilgrimage.
wait, wait. Do not say I said enough with the Hasidics. I don't need trouble, Wolfgang. That's a bad thing.
um,
That'll be cut out for
Never
sure.
mind that. So anyway, I went, there's a huge pilgrimage where about like 35, 40,000 Hasidic men come to the city of Uman in Ukraine every year for Rosh Hashanah. And then a little landmine story, a story on evacuations, and then some of the military coverage that I happened to get. So starting out, this is just driving around in Ukraine
This.
during the winter.
Oh, come look
And
at their
And these, I was debating buying an X-Pan last year, and so I just played around for a bit doing the same aspect ratio as that, and I made the choice not to buy that camera and spend way too much money on it. So, but I
Yeah,
was
and
just shooting in
Wolfgang,
black and white.
can you speak to the information that you're getting from your editors back home and how that relates to where you go and how long you stay in certain places?
Um, So with Ukraine, I mostly work in Donbass, and my editors kind of have me. They've got there's I'm a freelancer. I predominantly work with Anadolu, which is a Turkish wire service. They have their staff team that they jump around for a lot of like the spot news, like the big missile strike in Dnipro, missile strike in Kiev, the huge funeral for like a the what was that guy's name? I'm forgetting. There was a famous soldier at one point that died. They'll cover that kind of stuff, and I'm kind of the one of the photographers that predominantly works in Donbass, covering like the people stories, trying to get military access, that sort of stuff. But depending on their need for um, what kind of material is coming in, because wire services, they contribute to publications all around the world. So if there's less of a need of what's happening in Ukraine, like a few months ago, I went and I covered Israel and Palestine. That was more in demand for a couple of months, and they only had like 3 photographers, I think, working in Ukraine, when usually it's around like 8 since the beginning of the conflict. Um, so coming up, I asked about February, and I think I'll be going back to Ukraine, but it kind of depends on what the situation is in Israel and like what the need will be for that.
Yeah, here's a good question. What is it like to read reports of the war from Western media when you're actually there? Is there a difference between the re reporting and the reality ever jarring?
I think that depends. That depends definitely. Like I've read things that are more optimistic or more pessimistic while there, and it all depends on like the Ukraine has, just for example, speaking about like the actual front line and how things are going in the immediate battlefield, not so much like civilian morale or whatever. Um, there could be reports of like ammo shortages, and these guys aren't getting everything that they need. They're not well equipped. They don't have enough armor. And for a week straight, the guys that I've been with have all the ammo in the world, and they're just pissing through artillery rounds because they can, and they have it, and they keep getting more. But then the groups that got interviewed by whichever paper, they certainly did have a shortage, and it kind of, there's like little bubbles inside of bubbles, and it can depend on stuff. So sometimes though, like you'll hear that like Ukraine is doing super well and this, and then guys that I've talked to are like, we lost 65 out of 100 guys in the last month while we were trying to hold this area outside of Bakhmut, and it doesn't look as promising. But then you have to think that there's an almost 1,000 kilometer front line, and like this one little part of it is not doing good, but other parts can be
Right.
holding well. So it is like you have to take in so much information and talk to people there. And like, I know many of the people that are tuned in here have relatives or friends that are in Ukraine. Speaking to people that live there, I think, is the number one source of information.
Okay.
And so this then is kind of just a bunch of photos of the liberated areas in from a little bit east of Kharkiv to Kupiansk down to around Bakhmut, and then like a little bit south of there before it turns into like Zaporizhia, of civilians living through the winter. And we were working on that. And a lot of I was pretty interested in the folks that, like this guy, still live in the basements of these Khrushchev type buildings, because many of the windows are blown out in the apartments up above, or there's holes in the buildings. Even if the windows are there, heat retention in the basement is much better, and it's safer because a lot of these areas are still close enough to the front line that they do get shelled frequently to regularly. And it's just generally safer in the basement. So many people will stay down there, and like the living conditions are dark, damp, but a little bit more secure. And I think a lot of these are between like Izum, Kupiansk, Liman areas. This one
And
I liked a lot. We found this babushka in Stary Saltiv, which is a little bit east of Kharkiv, and she invited us in for tea, and I like had to get a portrait of her, and she had this awesome photo of Pam Anderson like hanging up in her house, and needed that next to her.
so, Wolfgang, you're shooting predominantly black and white. What are you shooting with, and why always black and white?
Oh, I do. I generally don't shoot black and white. did an edit for a portfolio in black and white, and I hadn't presented that anywhere, so I figured this was a good place for
Okay.
that. And I wanted to show off to Svet a little bit. So shout out to her for being the queen of black and white. I wanted to try and impress her. Um, so this was the Alan Chin talked about this. This was a building in Izum that during the right before the occupation, a bunch of civilians were again hiding in the cellar, and an aerial bomb, one of the 500 kilo to 1,000 kilo bombs from an airplane, struck this building, and it was around like 60 casualties happened there. And now it's kind of not like a touristy spot, but a lot of people do go there and they take pictures because it's some of the most like striking destruction in that town. People do that. And then this family that's here, there's a couple of young kids and they had their dog, and the husband was stealing copper from the building, and like not in like a negative way. It's just like no one's there, no one's using it. And people don't all have their jobs in this town, and not like most of like the jobs and work hasn't come back there yet. So people are scavenging a bit, and that's one of the tragic things about this is like they either you're getting humanitarian aid that comes in daily if your job has been vacant, trying to get bread that way, or if you need to make a couple bucks, like you can do this kind of thing and be a little bit resourceful. This is a humanitarian aid drop in Svetogirsk, which is where there's a famous monastery. This is in that monastery. And so yeah, for the winter trip, a lot of the days we had spent just trying to do interviews with civilians about life since liberation in a bunch of these towns. This is some sort of anti like an air protection missile, like a surface to air missile flying up to intercept something that Russia had in the sky.
And on this trip, are you by yourself? You with a fixer, other photojournalists?
In the winter, I was with my fixer and friend Stas, and then the summer into fall trip, I was with Svet for most of the time, and we covered a bunch of stuff together. So here, this is a handful of photos covering the military from both of those trips, and at the time, some of these were like in the periphery or like on the outskirts of Bakhmut during like the final month and a half of that. This was in between Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar, and kind of end of winter, like February, March time. It's just like total mud pit everywhere. Like Jeeps are getting stuck, like tanks are having a hard time. Um, and a lot of the like trench life, like the soldiers continuing to like burrow and live semi underground, and it's the safe spot. It was a really, really great article I had read about a year ago. It came out from Luke Mogelson, the New Yorker columnist, and I forget the name of it, the specific article, but he made this like just wonderful comparison between um, kind of the how everyone knows how important the soil is in Ukraine, and the black gold, the breadbasket of Ukraine, and then the reverence for that amongst the soldiers that burrow into the ground in their trenches, and like the kind of like reverence that they have for this land has kept their people alive and is now keeping them alive, like digging into it, and
Mm.
it's sheltering them and keeping them safe. Was a really beautiful thing, I thought.
Yeah. Very
And this one just felt like very World War I, like how like 100 years ago you could have had a similar, like if you changed that Kalashnikov to a Mosin, that could have been 100 years ago, and people are fighting exactly the same way.
nice.
No, always digging.
That's beautiful.
This was actually quite interesting. So this is a BM-21 Grad, I believe, is the vehicle and the launcher. And the rocket flying out of there, they had removed the explosive payload, the warhead that's in there, and it was with 24th Brigade. I'm pretty friendly with the press officer there, and he's given us like awesome access to a lot of stuff. They had like a joint operation going on with SBU, which is like the Ukrainian equivalent of the FBI or the uh, KGB kind of thing. And they took the payload out of that and they filled it with leaflets to fly over a Russian occupied area. And the leaflets had the surrender hotline in it. And they're trying to launch that over the Russian positions so that the Russian soldiers see that and hopefully they call in, or like a handful of them maybe get it in their head that they should surrender instead of sitting in a cold trench in the middle of Ukrainian winter. And maybe it works out. They do get a pretty high number of surrenders. I did have the he gave me a number and like up until that point, like how many they had taken in. I don't have that written down with me right now. But for that, they have so many different ways of kind of getting that information out there, whether it's through like Facebook groups or through their own information tactics. And this was just kind of one arm of that effort that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And these are some of the drone operators in 24th Brigade. And this is a really interesting thing in how warfare has shaped is just like the access and like the usability of these small drones. And it's something that like as a US citizen, it's like all of our wars, it's drone warfare is like from a Reaper that's flying 30,000 feet in the sky and can watch stuff. But to have these little like 1,000 to 3, this is a Mavic Pro, which is like 2,000-ish dollars. And every single unit, like you do some fundraising or your unit has money coming in from the Ministry of Defense and can buy these things. And each squad can get one if like you're a better off unit, or a platoon has a couple of them, or a company, and they can fly them up and keep an eye on the battlefield at all times. So you have like real-time situational awareness on like when a tank column is coming in, or um being able to, I saw something in the Southern counteroffensive that they fitted these with the thermal cameras, which are a bit more expensive. And they were maneuvering through minefields by seeing during the day the landmines, which are metal, heat up. And then at nighttime, they use the thermal and they can see where those mines are exactly in the ground. So it's used as like a spotting technique. So all of the different applications of like just surveillance drones and then the FPV drones are becoming a real big problem for both sides because they're buying these $200 Chinese racing drones that can carry like roughly 1 to 2 kilos of some sort of explosive, and then they just have it fly into the back of a tank or a vehicle or into individual soldiers and blow up. And that $300 then can render tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment and vehicles or manpower obsolete. So like the cost ratio is very favorable to that use. Of course, that my dog's whining. Sorry. And that was some drones. This is still.
Wow.
And that was a mortar team. This was the group that I was what I mentioned earlier. I was reading some article about like ammunition shortages, and these guys had like piles and piles and piles of 120 millimeter mortars. Um, and then this was on the north. Soledar was one of like the suburbs of Bakhmut that has like a really famous salt mine there. During the battle while that was taking place, these guys were like firing into before the Russians had taken Soledar. They were giving backup support. This one I just like because this is a very common patch that you see there. It's kind of crude. It's kind of funny. It's like soldiers though often have like their like crude jokes. So the 3CYZSU in Cyrillic, which is like the Armed Forces of Ukraine hub, and which is like the same font as like Pornhub because they basically make videos of themselves fucking Russians is the joke. And so you see that all the time there. That patch is super common.
It's interesting, Wolfgang, looking at your body of work after hearing Katria speak and, the correlation between what you're seeing on the ground and, the propaganda aspect of all of this. It
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
it really, blends together and you look at it with a whole different set of eyes and a different headset. It's really intriguing, but I just wanted to just say that.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's like you can have like malicious propaganda and you can have propaganda that's just trying to help as well. And I mean, Ukraine, like any other country at war, like they have their own propaganda, and like keeping morale high amongst citizens is definitely one of those. And like when you drive around that country, like there is no shortage of billboards and flags and like just heroic stuff happening from the military. Like that stuff is happening, but it is a form of propaganda to just be pushing that all of the time with the intent of swaying the population towards like staying favorable in this fight, and that is something that needs to be happening now for that country. I mean, the a lot of the friends that I talk to that are there, um, there's starting to be the shortage of new fighters coming in and people volunteering, and they're going to have to do a draft at some point because most of the guys that have wanted to fight at the beginning of the war, they've gone, either they've gotten injured, they've gotten killed, or they're still there and they're still fighting. And a lot of these guys are 2 years straight in combat with no relief, and Ukraine needs more young middle-aged men to fill the ranks so that they can kind of rotate out a lot of these units. And if they want to stage another large counteroffensive, like they're going to need a lot more men. And they're kind of running into that wall right now. So in the upcoming months, in the next year, there's going to have to be a large conscription or draft is going to come up. And there's a lot of people that don't want to fight because of I think Svet and Alan talked about this. Those were the only two that I watched this week. There's kind of a sense of like how far away the conflict is, and a lot of people, someone that was in here had commented on how it is very present for everyone, and like people, it shouldn't be viewed at as like people in Ukraine don't feel like attached to this, and like they're not just trying to like live their lives, but like they need to, and like that's completely true. And there's a lot of people that don't have any wish to fight in the war, and they've got their kids, they've got their family, like their priorities are not to go sit in a trench and hold the line against Russians, and being around the family is more important, or they could just, for any of a million reasons, not want to do that. So that's going to be an issue, I think, at some point on people weighing, do we want to keep fighting this? And
Yeah,
I don't have an
and
answer on either side of that, but there's
oh, but that that in and of itself is a storyline, right?
Mhm.
That they don't have enough soldiers, right? And how you can turn that into a propaganda piece, true or
Mhm.
not, right? There's not enough volunteers, or people are leaving, because they have children and they don't
Yeah,
want to, right? I mean, you have
yeah.
all these different angles. I know in some conflicts they get mercenaries from other countries.
Yeah, so Ukraine does do something similar with that. They do um the International Legion, amongst like a couple other groups. International Legion is the biggest one, and I think that the distinction is that it's not mercenaries in Ukraine, um, fighting because if I wanted to join, I would join International Legion or one of a few other groups, and to do that, I need to sign up for the Ukrainian military. So I'm on payroll. I'm a contracted fighter inside of their military. Whereas like the US was using like Blackwater amongst other groups that were not part of the United States military. They would get paid by the Pentagon
Mm.
or something, but it wasn't under the umbrella of the military. So International Legion in Ukraine, you are inside of the Ukrainian military. So I think that you're a foreign fighter, but it's not a mercenary, so to speak. I think there is like some sort of distinction there in how that's viewed by the law. And this was a triage outside of Bakhmut. And this is just back to some civilian stuff. I will, anytime I see one of these things, the motor block, I love this. Someone was talking about the horse and buggy that they had seen in
Yeah, I'm
Ukraine, and this is kind of the modern version of that. Just an engine with wheels. And this is the bit on mines in Ukraine, and in the past 2 years, Ukraine has become one of the most, if not the most, it's hard to tell right now, contaminated countries on the world for landmines. And there's something like roughly 170,000 square kilometers that are contaminated now in the country. And this was one of the units from Slavyansk. There's always a demining unit in many of the eastern areas of the country that works under DSNS, which is the safety services. So the same group that would have like paramedics or firefighters, that kind of thing, rescuers. There's a demining unit that's part of that branch of municipal service workers. And a lot of these guys prior to the war in 2014 and now we're still digging up ordnance from World War II. So there's German and Russian explosives in the ground from 80 years ago that this country was still dealing with. And a lot of these guys, they would work 4 or 5 days a week cleaning up that still. And now on top of it, they're doubling down in the amount of like unexploded ordnance or intentionally placed landmines. And
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Wolfgang,
go ahead.
like, how do you, like, what's your process as it relates to following this story versus that story? Is it generated by the folks who, are sending you there, go cover this, go cover that, or are you finding them on your own, or both?
Um, A little bit of both, a little bit of both. Like, so I'll constantly be like checking in with the editor, and it's like, hey, like this is usually like the priority for me is like working with military, and like that's like the most like strict with scheduling. So I'll message a bunch of press officers every single week, and it's like, hey, can we work? Can we work? Can we work on what days? Can we get that in? So then I'll know like Monday, Thursday, Friday, I am working with like these specific brigades, and then I fill the rest of the time by like throwing pitches at my editor on like I can continue this like work I've been doing on landmines, or like we can go and try and find like civilian stories in Izum on like heating issues and that kind of stuff. And the landmine thing, it's like I work with a wire service, so then those photos can be used by anyone else. And the landmine issue just keeps coming up and coming up and coming up. So like if we get stories from civilians or going out with deminers, then those photos can be used by other places. Or if I get enough material in the course of like a few days, we can package it as one full story that then they sell to different publications, and then that gets built off of. Um, and one of the cool things, like I really, whenever like I describe Ukraine to people, I always like say how magical of a place it is. And for me, part of that is just that like it's still a place like where like anything is possible if you meet the right person. And there's not so much like this bureaucratic bullshit and paperwork that you need to work through in just everyday life on like getting to the thing that you want. Yeah, there's a lot of time that like if you find the right person and you two can hit it off and you're friendly with each other and you can build that trust, you can get access to stuff as long as like you're like just work at it and you're determined. This
Right.
story, we for finding mine victims, we the fixer that I was using, Stas, we spent like 3 hours like driving into like little towns like towards the front line, like asking people if they knew anyone that had been injured. And it's like this would take years to just try and track people down this way. So we went to a hospital and asked the lady at reception, is there any way that like we can find out patients who have been injured by landmines? And in 45 minutes, we were sitting with like the director who had given us a list of 80 people that had been patients for landmine injuries. And like, can you imagine doing that in the US, like walking into a hospital and it's like, give me the contact information of patients that you've had that have been hurt this way? Like that would never happen. But here it's like still you can do that if you like you meet the right people and they think that your intention is good. And it was like we want to help share the tragedy that's happened to civilians here. So that's one of the things that I just like adore about this country is how like the human connection is still there and it's not like weighed down by just like litigious intent and worries about that. And this was a lady who she had stepped on a butterfly mine in her garden. Um, this guy, I believe it was the same with a butterfly mine. These are like very small plastic mines that like come out of a larger rocket, usually a grad. Like 100 of these will fly out, and it's plastic, so mine detectors won't always pick them up. And it's not big enough to the explosive isn't big enough to kill you, but it can blow off the front of your foot, the back of your foot. If you're barefoot, like you could just lose your foot, and it's kind of meant to just like maim you. And if it's a soldier, he won't be fighting anymore if he doesn't have a foot. This is the field there. So yeah, this is Uman is a crazy, crazy experience where this town in central Ukraine, one of the most important rabbis in Hasidic Judaism at the very beginning of it, he um, he resided here in this town, and They have a synagogue there now, actually several of them, but the famous one where he's buried, this is kind of on the exterior of that building. There's a lake that he swam in that everyone gathers around. And so every single year for Rosh Hashanah, 30 plus thousand Hasidic Jews travel from all over the world. And it's really bizarre going there because like you're in the middle of Ukraine, but in this one neighborhood, all of the signs for the buildings, it's in Hebrew. Everyone's speaking Hebrew. They're speaking Yiddish. There's a lot of American Jews from New York and New Jersey that come there. So you hear English and it's like no Ukrainian or Russian is being spoken there. And you feel like you're on like a totally different, or you're in a different country. So I was there with Svet the whole time and it was like a really strange, bizarre week to just like you step into this town, you're in a totally different place. Um, but yeah, it was interesting time.
And you got access there. It looks pretty easily, huh?
More so for me because I'm a guy than Svet had access. The Hasidic crowd, the very Orthodox guys, are not very open to women. So I had to wear to get into the synagogue. I had to put on like the kippah, the yarmulke to go in. I'm not Jewish, but they all. Um, that was interesting how that was fine on every day except for Shabbat. If I wore a kippah and I was in there, that made access easier on Shabbat when I went into the synagogue and I had the yarmulke on, they kicked me out instantly because I was a bad Jew for taking photos inside. But then if I took it off, I'm a goy and I don't know what I'm doing, so then it's fine on Shabbat. So it was interesting, and they have all these like funny like loopholes and rules like on Shabbat, like Jews, you can't light a cigarette, you can't ignite a flame, but like they'll get a non or a goy who is non-Jew like me to light someone's cigarette for them, and then they can light their cigarettes off of each other. And just lots of silly little loopholes that they
Yeah,
have.
here's an interesting comment from Mark. The photo shows how ridiculous the Russian narrative is. Why would Hasidic Jews flock to a country that is apparently full of Nazis?
Yeah, yeah,
And I could bring a Brooklyn reference. When I was a kid, it was a Jewish and Catholic neighborhood, but occasionally a religious Jewish family would come to see a kid on the street. Are you a goy? And I said, yeah, come, just shut the lights off for us because they wouldn't touch
yeah, yeah,
the lights. I remember that.
yeah. Yeah, it was a really, really remarkable experience to go and see. And I'd say I didn't grow up in Brooklyn. I've never been around like so many Orthodox Jews before, and it was a really bizarre, very cool, very like unique, I thought, experience to get to go and witness that. This is in Slavyansk, just a woman by the water. This was these guys were actually foreign fighters. They were Colombians, I believe, Colombian or Peruvian, I think. And it was a six or seven of these guys. Bet speaks pretty good Spanish. We had like run into them. They were like swimming in a lake and just like having fun at the end of summer. This was during a couple days that we had spent with an evacuation crew, which I started to develop like some pretty strong opinions about like this whole process on why the Ukraine. I would like to do a story on this when I go back on why Ukraine authorities are still allowing young foreign kids to do these evacuations. And at this point, it's mostly foreigners doing this. Where by evacuations, I mean like at the very, very front line, there's still plenty of civilians that live in these towns, like usually nowhere near like the original population. Like this town is a little bit outside Kupiansk, and the original population is like 2,000. Now there's maybe like 30 or 40 people living there. But I was with a Polish kid and an American guy that were driving in daily to this area that gets shelled like 50 times per day. Shells are landing in this town, and they go gate to gate knocking on the gate. There's no cell service. They're just trying to find people, ask them to leave. I think we were 4 days with them. Nobody came this whole time, and it's like this front line hasn't moved for one. I think when I was taking these photos the following week, it was 1 year since liberation. Nobody's leaving. That if they want to, they'll get out, they'll do it. But it's been 1 year, they haven't done it. And my question is like, why are the authorities still letting these people go in and like risk their lives daily to do this? When these people, they're kind of the evacuation guys, like they'll bring food and they'll bring water, and that is like a really heroic thing to do. It's very selfless. But it is in a way you could have the opinion, like I do, that it's kind of enabling this population to stay there in harm's way. If there wasn't food and there wasn't water, you're not going to stay. So you don't hear about people starving to death in Ukraine. It's like if you are living on the front line and you don't have access to the things that are keeping you alive, you're going to relocate. So in a way, these guys are enabling them. They are trying to get them to leave, but as long as the people that are there are getting the things that they need to survive, they're going to stay. They don't want to move somewhere else. So last year, I think there was a couple evacuators that had been killed by shelling or like targeted fire. But yeah, these areas, like this was in that town. It's just like totally abandoned. Like there's like essentially no one there. The only way that they're getting goods in is through these volunteers that are bringing in food and water to them. And then this was kind of just like end of summer life in the Kupiansk area. These are just a couple of photos of a Ukrainian unit called Black Tulip, who does they extract the bodies from near front line or outside of the front line. And this was a little bit outside of Izum. These are two Russian soldiers that someone had found their corpses. They died in shelling. And this is a Ukrainian unit that they will collect these bodies and then they try to exchange them with the Russians, which is a pretty interesting story. So like both sides have the dead of the other side amongst their own dead, but there is a pretty good relation between these groups on the Russian and the Ukrainian sides that actively try to exchange the dead. So like these guys every like week or 2 weeks, we weren't allowed to go with that because they have to go do these like meetings on the very front line where like trucks drive up at a designated point and both sides kind of tell each other don't fire here during this hour and they'll bring like the dead that they had found that week and exchange that so that then the families on both sides can get the bodies of their loved ones back. And then I was just closing here with more of just driving, shooting out the window photos in winter because a lot of when I think about Ukraine is how much time I spend in a car, and that is a huge, huge country. And every journalist that's working there is spending hundreds, if not thousands, of hours sitting in cars, zipping around, and that is it.
And how long have you been there? I mean, all combined, Wolfgang.
I think since January of 22, probably like 14 months now.
And plans to go back?
Yeah, so I'm waiting to find out from my editors. I'm going to go somewhere in middle of February and then probably be gone for a few months. So either Ukraine or back to Israel and Palestine, but that depends on the situation there. So if the situation stays roughly the same in Israel and Palestine with no access to Gaza, then I'll be back to Ukraine for the 2-year anniversary of the full invasion.